single stroke of a pen that instantly doubled the size of a nation without a single shot being fired. It was 1803. The American experiment was fragile, hemmed in by the Atlantic and the mighty Mississippi. To the west lay a vast, shadowed empire owned by a man who wanted to conquer the world, Napoleon Bonaparte. One desperate deal, born of slave revolts in the Caribbean and frozen winters in Europe, would hand the United States the keys to a continent. It wasn't just a land deal, it was the greatest real estate gamble in human history. Chapter 1: The Choke Point at New Orleans. In the early 1800s, the United States ended at the Mississippi River. For the rugged frontiersmen living in Kentucky and Tennessee, that river wasn't just water, it was their only pulse. Every bushel of wheat and every barrel of pork had to float down the Mississippi to the port of New Orleans. Control New Orleans, and you controlled the heart of America. At the time, the port was held by a fading Spanish empire, but whispers began to drift across the Atlantic that chilled President Thomas Jefferson to the bone. A secret treaty had been signed. Spain was handing the Louisiana Territory back to France, and France was now led by the most dangerous man in Europe, Napoleon Bonaparte. Jefferson, a man who dreamed of an empire of liberty, saw a nightmare approaching. If Napoleon, the military genius who was currently toppling kingdoms, stationed his veteran Grande Armée in New Orleans, the United States would be strangled in its crib. The American West was screaming for war. They wanted to seize New Orleans by force before the French arrived. Jefferson knew he had to act fast, but he didn't want a bloodbath. He wanted a deal. He called upon his trusted friend James Monroe and gave him a mission that seemed impossible. Go to Paris. Find a way to buy New Orleans. If you fail, we may have to marry ourselves to the British fleet for protection. Monroe set sail with a budget of $2 million and a heavy burden. He was going to negotiate with a dictator who didn't like to lose. But little did Monroe know, by the time his ship touched French soil, the entire world would have shifted on its axis. While James Monroe was tossing on the Atlantic waves, the fate of the American West was being decided not in Washington, but in the humid, blood-soaked jungles of Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti. Napoleon Bonaparte had a grand vision, a new world empire. He planned to use the Louisiana Territory as a massive granary to feed his sugar-producing colonies in the Caribbean. To Napoleon, the Mississippi River was just a supply line for his crown jewel, Saint-Domingue. But there was one man standing in his way, Toussaint Louverture. Louverture led a massive, successful slave revolt that defied the French Empire. Napoleon sent 20,000 of his finest troops to crush the rebellion and restore slavery. He expected a quick victory. Instead, he got a massacre, not just from the fierce resistance of the formerly enslaved people, but from a microscopic enemy, yellow fever. By the time Monroe was nearing France, Napoleon's army had been decimated. Ships were returning to France filled with coffins instead of sugar. Napoleon was furious, frustrated, and most importantly, broke. The sudden pivot. Napoleon was a man of cold calculation. He realized that without Saint-Domingue, the Louisiana Territory was a useless frozen wilderness that he couldn't protect. He knew that the moment war broke out again with Great Britain, which was inevitable, the British Navy would simply sail into the Gulf of Mexico and take Louisiana for themselves. He turned to his Treasury Minister, Barbé Marbeau, and made a shocking decision. I renounce Louisiana. It is not only New Orleans that I will cede, it is the whole colony without any reservation. The ambush in Paris. In April 1803, Robert Livingston, the American minister to France, was already in Paris, desperately trying to negotiate just for the city of New Orleans. He was prepared to haggle over every street corner. Suddenly, the French Treasury Minister approached him with a proposal that left Livingston speechless. How much would you give for the entirety of Louisiana? Livingston blinked. He had been sent to buy a city. He was being offered a third of a continent. It was 828,000 square miles, stretching from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains, from the Gulf of Mexico to the Canadian border. The Great Dilemma. When James Monroe finally arrived in Paris, dusty and exhausted from his journey, Livingston broke the news. The price for this gargantuan empire? $15 million. In today's money, that's roughly $340 million, less than the cost of a single modern fighter jet or a professional sports stadium. It worked out to about 3 cents an acre. But there was a massive problem. Monroe and Livingston didn't have the authority to buy it. Their instructions from President Jefferson were clear. Buy New Orleans for $2 million, maybe $10 million at most. They had no way to communicate with Washington in real time. A letter would take 2 months to cross the ocean and return. They were standing in a drafty office in Paris, holding the future of the United States in their hands. If they hesitated, Napoleon might change his mind. If they signed, they were technically breaking the law and spending money the U.S. Treasury didn't have. They looked at the map. They looked at each other. They knew if they didn't grab this land, the British would, or the French might stay and build a wall of bayonets against American expansion forever. They decided to gamble. They wouldn't wait for Jefferson's permission. They would sign the treaty and pray the American people would forgive them for doubling the size of the country overnight.
The ink was dry in Paris, but the storm was just beginning in Washington, D.C. When the news finally reached the shores of the United States in July 1803, the nation didn't erupt in immediate celebration. Instead, it plunged into a legal and political firestorm that threatened to tear the young government apart. Jefferson's agony. President Thomas Jefferson was a man of strict principles. He believed in strict construction, the idea that the government could only do what was written in the Constitution. He looked through the document page by page, searching for a single line that gave a president the power to buy foreign land. He found nothing. Jefferson was terrified. He believed that by signing this treaty, he was acting like a monarch, the very thing he fought a revolution to overthrow. He privately wrote that the purchase was an act beyond the Constitution. He even considered proposing a constitutional amendment just to make the deal legal. But there was a ticking clock. Napoleon was notoriously impulsive. Reports from Paris suggested the emperor was already having seller's remorse. If Jefferson waited months for an amendment to pass, Napoleon might rip up the treaty and send his warships to the Gulf. The Federalist fury. While Jefferson wrestled with his conscience, his political rivals, the Federalists, were screaming foul. They didn't care about the price. They cared about power. The Federalists, based mostly in New England, realized that this massive new territory would eventually be carved into new states. These states would be filled with farmers and frontiersmen, people who would vote for Jefferson's party. The Federalists feared that by doubling the size of the country, Jefferson was effectively erasing the political influence of the North. They called the purchase a vast wilderness that will prove a curse. They argued that the United States was already large enough and that trying to govern land 2,000 miles away was a recipe for collapse. The decision that changed everything. Jefferson's closest advisors, including James Madison, begged him to stay quiet about his constitutional doubts. They told him, "The Senate has the power to make treaties. This is a treaty. Don't overthink it." Jefferson faced a choice: stick to his rigid legal philosophy and lose the West, or break his own rules to secure the future of the American people. He chose the latter. He swallowed his pride and pushed the treaty to the Senate for a vote. He realized that this wasn't just about land. It was about removing a European superpower from the American border forever. The race to the finish. The debate in the Senate was fierce. Critics argued that the United States was buying a pig in a poke. Nobody even knew where the borders of Louisiana truly ended. Did it include Texas? Did it include West Florida? No one knew. But the lure of the West was too strong. On October 20th, 1803, the Senate ratified the treaty by a vote of 24-7. The United States had officially bought an empire. But there was one final awkward problem. The Spanish flag was still flying over New Orleans, and the Spanish were furious. They claimed Napoleon had no right to sell the land in the first place. For a few tense weeks, the world waited to see if the transition would be a peaceful handoff or a three-way war between America, France, and Spain. The deal was signed on paper, but on the ground, the situation was chaotic. In late 1803, the vast territory of Louisiana was in a strange geopolitical limbo. Spain had officially returned the land to France, but French officials hadn't even arrived to take control yet. For the people living in New Orleans, a melting pot of French Creoles, Spanish, just a real estate transaction. It was the big bang of American history. With the stroke of a pen, the trajectory of the world shifted. But as the 19th century dawned, the true cost of the deal began to emerge, a cost measured in blood, gold, and the very soul of the nation. The economic explosion. The purchase turned the United States into an economic juggernaut. The port of New Orleans became the third largest city in the country, a glittering, chaotic hub where the wealth of the interior, cotton, tobacco, and timber, met the markets of the world. The Mississippi River became the backbone of a new American economy. But this wealth was built on a knife's edge. The Cotton Kingdom exploded into the newly acquired lands of Louisiana, Arkansas, and Missouri. This meant that the institution of slavery, which many of the founding fathers hoped would slowly die out, was given a massive, violent second life. The purchase didn't just expand American soil, it expanded the reach of the shackles. The shadow of the Civil War. For every new state that petitioned to join the Union from the Louisiana Territory, a screaming match erupted in Congress. The North wanted the new lands to be free. The South insisted they be open to slavery. The Louisiana Purchase forced a question that the Constitution had tried to ignore. Can a nation exist half slave and half free? Just 17 years after the purchase, the Missouri Compromise of 1820 had to be drawn across the map of the new territory, a literal line in the sand. Thomas Jefferson, now an old man at his home in Monticello, heard the news of this political divide and called it a fire bell in the night. He knew that the land he bought to secure America's future, changing global politics, science, and the very definition of what it meant to be American. The financial ghost, the Baring brothers. One of the most ironic parts of the story is how the United States, with a very little cash, actually paid for the land. To get the money to Napoleon, the U.S. had to take out massive loans. Who provided the loans? The British. Even though Britain and France were bitter enemies on the verge of war, the British banking house of Baring Brothers financed the deal. In essence, British bankers funded the U.S. purchase of French land so that Napoleon would have the cash to build an army to invade Britain. It was a tangled web of global finance that proved money has no soul and no borders. The science of an empire. Jefferson's gamble turned the U.S. into a laboratory. The specimens sent back by explorers, bones of prehistoric creatures, new species of plants, and maps of the jagged Rockies changed the world's understanding of natural history. The American mind was transformed. It replaced the European way of thinking with a frontier mentality. The idea of the manifest destiny, The belief that the U.S. was destined to stretch from ocean to ocean was born in the soil of the Louisiana Territory. A strategic masterstroke. If the deal hadn't happened, the North American map today would look like Europe, a collection of 5 or 6 medium-sized competing nations. Imagine needing a passport to cross the Mississippi River or a different currency to visit Denver. By removing France from the heart of the continent, the U.S. avoided the constant border wars that plagued Europe for centuries. The moral reckoning. We cannot ignore that the Louisiana Purchase was the ultimate stolen land deal. Napoleon sold land he didn't truly inhabit to a government that hadn't seen it yet. The legacy of the purchase is inextricably linked to the Indian Appropriations Act and the eventual reservation system. It remains a story of incredible vision and incredible tragedy, a double-edged sword that created a superpower at the expense of its original inhabitants.
Secrets. The Louisiana Purchase is no different. Beyond the dusty treaties and the changing flags, there were dark plots and what-if scenarios that could have changed the world forever. The Spanish deep state spy. While Jefferson was negotiating with Napoleon, he didn't realize that one of his own top generals was a traitor. General James Wilkinson, the man Jefferson sent to take formal possession of New Orleans, was actually Agent 13, a secret spy on the Spanish payroll. Even as he raised the American flag, Wilkinson was sending secret letters to the Spanish king, advising him on how to protect Mexico from American expansion. If Wilkinson's double life had been exposed earlier, the entire transfer of power could have collapsed into a civil war or a Spanish invasion. The what-if of 1802. The purchase almost never happened because of a freak weather event. In 1802, Napoleon had gathered a massive fleet in the Netherlands, ready to sail to New Orleans to reinforce his empire. He was ready to turn the Mississippi into a French fortress. But a massive ice storm froze the fleet in the harbor for weeks. By the time the ice melted, the situation in the Caribbean had turned into a disaster for the French, and Napoleon lost his nerve. If the winter of 1802 had been mild, the United States might never have expanded west of the Mississippi. The Texas controversy.
When Monroe and Livingston signed the treaty, they asked the French ministers, "What are the exact borders of what we are buying?" The French minister, Talleyrand, gave a chillingly vague answer. "I can tell you nothing. You have made a noble bargain for yourselves, and I suppose you will make the most of it." This vagueness was intentional. It led to decades of blood-soaked border disputes. The U.S. claimed the purchase included Texas. Spain said it didn't. This confusion eventually led to the Mexican-American War and the Texas Revolution. The sale of the century was, in many ways, the lawsuit of the century. The Napoleon escape plan. Years later, after Napoleon was defeated at Waterloo and exiled, a group of French settlers in New Orleans, the Napoleonic exiles, actually plotted to rescue him and bring him to Louisiana. They even built a house for him in New Orleans. It still stands today as the Napoleon House. The plan was to have the emperor rule a new Napoleonic state in the heart of the American West. While it sounds like a movie plot, the U.S. government took the rumors seriously enough to keep a close watch on the French Creoles in the territory for years. The final narrative conclusion. The Louisiana Purchase wasn't just a map change. It was a chaotic, lucky, and sometimes dirty business. It was built on the backs of Haitian revolutionaries, financed by British bankers, and secured by American diplomats who broke the rules. It proved that history isn't always a straight line of progress. It's often a series of accidents, gambles, and bold decisions made by people who had no idea what the world would look like 200 years later. To truly understand the Louisiana Purchase, you have to look past the maps and the money. You have to look at the people whose lives were upended in an instant. This was the moment the American identity was forged in the heat of the Western sun. The Great Migration. Once the deal was finalized, the floodgates opened. It wasn't just soldiers and politicians anymore. It was thousands of ordinary families, farmers from Virginia, immigrants from Germany, and dreamers from New England, piling their lives into covered wagons. They were heading into a land they called the Great American Desert, but what they found was the richest soil on the planet. This mass movement of people created the American West as we know it today. It gave birth to the legend of the cowboy, the pioneer, and the rugged individualist. But it also created a collision of cultures. The forgotten citizens. In New Orleans, the transition was tense. The French and Spanish elites, the Creoles, hated the Kintucks, the rough-and-tumble Americans coming down the river. They saw Americans as uncultured, loud, and dangerous. For a few decades, New Orleans became one of the most unique places on earth, a city where French law, Spanish architecture, American commerce, and African music melted together. It was here, in the years following the purchase, that jazz began its long, slow birth in places like Congo Square. The purchase didn't just buy land, it bought a culture that would eventually define American music and art for the world. The final piece of the puzzle, 1812. The story of the Louisiana Purchase has a final boss moment. In 1814, the British, who had never truly accepted the American expansion, sent a massive invasion force to seize New Orleans. They wanted to take back the sale of the century by force. At the Battle of New Orleans, a ragtag army of American frontiersmen, French pirates, free men of color, and Choctaw warriors stood together under Andrew Jackson. They crushed the British veterans of the Napoleonic Wars. This victory was the final receipt for the Louisiana Purchase. It proved to the world that the United States didn't just own the land on paper, they were willing to bleed for it. It was the moment the purchase became permanent. The epic conclusion, a nation reborn. In 1803, Thomas Jefferson sat in a half-finished White House fearing he had destroyed the Constitution to save a dream. In Paris, Napoleon Bonaparte counted his gold, thinking he had sold a useless wilderness to fund his European wars. They were both wrong. Jefferson hadn't destroyed the country, he had given it the room to become a superpower, And Napoleon hadn't just sold land, he had handed over the keys to the 20th century. The Louisiana Purchase remains the greatest what-if in history. If the deal had failed, the United States might be a small coastal nation today, perhaps no larger than Italy or Germany. Instead, it became a continental giant, a manifest destiny fueled by $15 million and a world of ambition. The sale of the century was over. The era of America began.
This chapter 12 is designed to be a mega chapter. We are going deep into the political warfare and the duels that almost killed the deal before the ink was even dry. Chapter 12, The Serpent and the Sage, the War at Home. While Monroe and Livingston were celebrating in the wine-soaked halls of Paris, a different kind of war was erupting in the mud-caked streets of Washington, D.C. This was the era of hand-to-hand politics. The Louisiana Purchase was not a victory lap, it was a street fight. The Federalists' poison pen. The Federalists, led by men who worshipped at the altar of Alexander Hamilton, were horrified. They didn't see the Purchase as a great expansion, they saw it as a hostile takeover. In the newspapers of Boston and New York, they unleashed a campaign of fear. They argued that by adding this great wasteland, Jefferson was diluting the blood of the original colonies. One Federalist senator famously shouted that giving the vote to the wild men of the West would turn the American government into a mobocracy. They spread rumors that the land was inhabitable, that it was nothing but shifting sands and mammoth bones. They even tried to use the Constitution as a weapon to stop the payment. They knew that if Jefferson succeeded, their political party, the party of the elites, would be extinct within a generation. They were right. The duel in the dark. At the center of this chaos was a man whose name is synonymous with American scandal, Aaron Burr. Burr was Jefferson's vice president, but the two men loathed each other. Burr saw the Louisiana Purchase as his own personal playground. While Jefferson dreamed of liberty, Burr dreamed of empire. Behind Jefferson's back, Burr began meeting with British ministers and disgruntled Westerners. There are historical whispers, deeply supported by evidence, that Burr wanted to use the chaos of the Purchase to break away from the United States. He wanted to take New Orleans, combine it with a portion of the new Purchase and Mexico, and crown himself Emperor of the West. The Purchase didn't just expand the U.S., it nearly triggered a secessionist coup. Jefferson had to manage the French, the Spanish, the British, and his own traitorous vice president all at the same time. The Midnight Anxiety. Jefferson was a man of the Enlightenment, a man who hated energetic government. Yet to secure Louisiana, he had to become a Cromwellian figure. He had to authorize the secret movement of troops to the border. He had to stay up until the early hours of the morning, writing letters to skeptical senators, essentially bribing and cajoling them to vote for ratification. He wrote to his friend, "The less we say about constitutional difficulties, the better. We must maximize the moment." This was the moral gray area of the Purchase. To save the American Republic, Jefferson felt he had to violate its most sacred legal principles. He was haunted by the idea that he was setting a precedent for future presidents to act like dictators. Every time a modern president uses an executive order today, they are standing on the ground Jefferson broke in 1803. The financial trap. And then there was the money. $15 million doesn't sound like much, but in 1803, the U.S. federal budget was only about $7 million a year. Jefferson was essentially putting the entire country into debt slavery to foreign banks. The Federalists mocked him. "You hate banks, yet you have handed our future to the British bankers. You hate debt, yet you have shackled our children to interest payments for decades." Jefferson's only defense was the manifest destiny of the soil.
He believed that the wheat and cotton grown in the West would pay back the debt 1,000 times over. He was betting the entire existence of the United States on the productivity of a land he had never seen. The final showdown in the Senate. The day of the vote was October 20th, 1803. The gallery was packed. The tension was thick to cut with a saber. If the Senate rejected the treaty, Napoleon would keep the money, which was already being moved, and keep the land. The U.S. would be bankrupt and surrounded. When the final vote was tallied, 24-7, Jefferson didn't cheer. He simply retreated to his office. He had won the land, but he had lost his constitutional purity. The United States was no longer a small, innocent experiment. It was now a global player, with all the debt, the enemies, and the moral complexities that come with power. While the politicians in D.C. were arguing over commas and constitutions, a different kind of history was being written in the mud and the tall grass. The moment the treaty was signed, the Louisiana Territory became a magnet for the desperate, the brave, and the lawless. This was the initial shock of expansion. The myth of the empty land. To the average American in 1803, the West was a fantasy. Jefferson himself believed the territory might contain woolly mammoths, active volcanoes, and a mountain made entirely of solid salt. He believed that the blue-tinged mountains seen in the distance were the Stony Mountains, the Rockies, and once you crossed them, you'd see the Pacific Ocean immediately. He was wrong. Dead wrong. The first trappers and mountain men who pushed past the Mississippi didn't find a paradise. They found a vertical wall of granite and ice that stretched for thousands of miles. They found a great American desert where the heat could kill a horse in a day and the blizzards could bury a wagon train in an hour. This wasn't a peaceful garden. It was a brutal, beautiful fortress. The clash of empires on the ground. The United States bought Louisiana from France, but the French weren't really there. The people who were there didn't care about a piece of paper signed in Paris. The Sioux and the Comanche. These were the true superpowers of the plains. They had mastered the horse, introduced by the Spanish, and were at the height of their military might. When the first American explorers arrived, they weren't greeted as owners, they were treated as trespassing merchants. The Spanish saboteurs. Even though Spain had given the land back to France, they were terrified of Americans reaching their silver mines in Mexico. The Spanish governor in Santa Fe actually sent 4 separate military expeditions into the Louisiana Territory with secret orders to find Lewis and Clark and arrest them or eliminate them. The West was a chessboard of secret agents and tribal warriors long before the first town was ever built. The White Gold Rush. What drove the first wave of people across the river? It wasn't gold, it was beaver fur. In 1803, the fashion in London and Paris was felt hats made from beaver pelts. The Louisiana Territory was the world's greatest reservoir of this white gold. Thousands of young men, many of them veterans of the Revolutionary War or poor immigrants, disappeared into the wilderness. They lived like the tribes, married into the tribes, and often died in the wilderness. They were the scouts of empire, the ones who found the mountain passes that would later become the Oregon Trail. The lawless frontier. Because the U.S. government had no police force for a territory that large, Louisiana became the ultimate hideout. Outlaws, pirates from the Gulf, and debtors fleeing the east vanished into the Purchase. For the first 20 years, the Louisiana Territory was the most lawless place on the planet. It was a world where your law was the rifle over your shoulder. The United States had bought the land, but they hadn't bought order. They had purchased a wild, breathing entity that would take a century to tame. And in the process of taming it, the American character itself was transformed. The polite Virginian was replaced by the rugged frontiersman. The First Contact Tragedy. As the first American settlements began to dot the Missouri River, a silent killer moved faster than the wagons.
smallpox. The purchase didn't just bring people, it brought biological warfare. Entire Mandan villages, which had been thriving for centuries, were wiped out in weeks. The maps were being cleared of people before the Americans even had time to name the rivers. This is the dark underside of the noble bargain, a continental shift that was as much about tragedy as it was about triumph.
Not as a real estate payment, but as a military investment, the Louisiana Purchase takes on a much darker, more global tone. This wasn't just a sale, it was the fuel for a fire that would consume Europe from Moscow to Madrid. Napoleon's War Chest. When Napoleon Bonaparte received the final confirmation that the American gold was coming, he didn't use it to build schools or roads. He didn't use it to help the French people. He immediately funneled that money into the Camp of Boulogne. He gathered 200,000 soldiers, thousands of horses, and a massive flotilla of transport ships on the French coast. His goal? The total invasion and conquest of Great Britain. The American Purchase of Missouri, Kansas, and Nebraska literally paid for the bayonets and gunpowder that Napoleon intended to use to crush the British Empire. To the rest of the world, the United States had just become the silent partner in Napoleon's quest for world domination. The British irony. Here is the part that sounds like a conspiracy theory, but is 100% historical fact. The British government allowed the deal to happen. The British Navy ruled the Atlantic. They could have easily intercepted the ships carrying the gold or blocked the legal transfer of funds. So why did they let their enemy, Napoleon, get the money? Because the British bankers, the Baring brothers, convinced the British government that a strong United States was a better, lesser evil than a French-controlled North America. The British figured that if America owned Louisiana, they could eventually trade with them or take it from them later. They chose to let Napoleon have the cash today so they could deal with the American problem tomorrow. It was a cold-blooded gamble. The British essentially gambled that they could survive Napoleon's invasion, which they did thanks to Admiral Nelson at Trafalgar, while keeping the Americans in their debt. The scorched earth result. While Americans were peacefully surveying the plains of Iowa, the money they paid was causing scorched earth in Europe. It funded the Battle of Austerlitz, where Napoleon crushed the Third Coalition. It paid for the Grand Armée's march into the heart of Germany. It solidified Napoleon's grip on the throne, allowing him to crown himself emperor in a ceremony of ego that shocked the world. Jefferson, the man of peace, had inadvertently funded the greatest war machine the world had ever seen. He famously said he wanted an empire of liberty, but he bought it with blood money that was currently being used to tear down the old world. The American guilt. Back in Washington, Jefferson's enemies wouldn't let him forget it. The Federalists attacked him in the press. "Every dollar we sent to Paris is a drop of blood from a European peasant," they claimed. The U.S. was in a strange position. To the French, they were the useful idiots who provided cash for a useless wilderness. To the British, they were treacherous cousins who funded an enemy. To the rest of the world, America was no longer a neutral observer. They were a player in the great game of empires. The 1812 trap. This financial connection created a resentment in London that never truly went away. The British felt that America had cheated by buying land from a dictator they were trying to overthrow. This resentment simmered for 9 years. It led to the British boarding American ships, the kidnapping of American sailors, impressment, and finally, the War of 1812. The Louisiana Purchase wasn't just a deal that ended in 1803. It was the primary reason the British eventually sailed up the Potomac and burned the White House to the ground in 1814. The sale of the century came with a hidden price tag, a second war of independence. Chapter 16. The Secret Map of 1804. As the war raged in Europe, a small group of men was moving silently through the American interior.
They weren't soldiers, they were ghost mappers. While Lewis and Clark get all the fame, there were secret expeditions like the Dunbar Hunter expedition sent by Jefferson to the southern reaches of the Purchase. Their mission was to find out if there were secret Spanish gold mines or hidden French settlements that hadn't been reported. What they found was something far more valuable: the Red River and the Washita River, the water highways that would allow the U.S. to dominate the southern trade routes. The New World was finally being mapped, and every river discovered was another nail in the coffin of European influence in America.
Anna, they didn't just buy dirt and trees, they bought New Orleans. At the time, New Orleans was unlike any other city in America. It wasn't like the brick-and-mortar Protestant towns of Boston or Philadelphia. It was a Mediterranean fever dream dropped into a Louisiana swamp, a place of wrought iron balconies, hidden courtyards, and a social structure so complex it made the head of any rational American spin. The Creole Resistance. The people of New Orleans, the Creoles, descendants of French and Spanish settlers, did not want to be American. To them, the Americans were cane-tucks, loud, unwashed, violent frontiersmen who chewed tobacco and had no respect for the fine arts of wine, fencing, or the Catholic Church. When the first American governor, William C.C. Claiborne, arrived, he didn't speak a word of French or Spanish. He sat in the cabildo, the town hall, and tried to explain trial by jury to a population that followed the Napoleonic Code. In the American system, you were innocent until proven guilty. In the French system, the law was the word of the state. The Creoles saw the American legal system as chaotic and barbaric. For the first few years, the city was a powder keg. There were brawls in the streets over which language should be spoken in the markets, and riots in the ballrooms over whether a French waltz or an American square dance should be played first. The third class, the three people of color. The most unique, and for the Americans, the most terrifying part of New Orleans was the existence of a massive, wealthy, and educated class of free people of color, gens de couleur libre. Unlike the rest of the American South, where you were either white and free or black and enslaved, New Orleans had a middle ground. These were people of mixed African and European descent who owned property, ran businesses, and even served in their own elite military militias. They spoke perfect French, dressed in the latest Parisian fashions, and held high social status. When the Americans arrived with their rigid two-tiered racial laws, they tried to strip these people of their rights. The free people of color fought back with petitions, lawsuits, and the threat of armed resistance. They were the living contradiction to the American dream, proving that the racial lines the U.S. was trying to draw were far more blurred than the politicians in Washington wanted to admit. Voodoo and the shadow economy. While the politicians argued in the daylight, a different power ruled the night: Marie Laveau and the world of New Orleans voodoo. The Purchase had brought a refugee from the Haitian Revolution, both planters and enslaved people. They brought with them a powerful, secretive religion that blended West African spirits with Catholic saints. In the dark corners of Congo Square, the drums beat every Sunday. This was a shadow government. Enslaved people used these gatherings to exchange information, plan escapes, and maintain a culture that the American owners could not understand or control. For the American newcomers, the sound of the drums was a constant reminder that they had bought a territory they did not truly possess. The Pirate King, Jean Lafitte. You cannot tell the story of the Louisiana Purchase without the man who owned the coast, Jean Lafitte. Lafitte was a privateer, a polite word for pirate, who ran a massive smuggling empire out of Barataria Bay. He didn't care about the U.S. Treasury or Napoleon's treaties. He saw the Purchase as a massive business opportunity. He smuggled stolen goods and enslaved people directly into the city, bypassing American taxes. The U.S. government tried to arrest him, but the people of New Orleans loved him. He provided them with cheap silk, fine wine, and spices that the American government tried to tax. Lafitte was the ghost of the Gulf, a reminder that the borders of the Louisiana Purchase were porous, dangerous, and controlled by men who answered to no flag. The architecture of tension, the French Quarter. The city literally split in two. The Americans, finding themselves unwelcome in the old French Quarter, built their own district on the other side of Canal Street, now the Central Business District. Canal Street became the neutral ground, a wide strip of land where the two cultures met but rarely mingled. If you crossed the street, you were effectively entering a different country. This tension created the dueling oaks in City Park, where young men from both sides settled their differences with rapiers and pistols nearly every morning at dawn. The ultimate synthesis. Despite the hatred and the riots, something magical began to happen. The French obsession with food met the African knowledge of spices and the Spanish love of seafood. The result was Creole cuisine, gumbo, jambalaya, and etouffee. The American can-do spirit met the French joie de vivre. New Orleans didn't become Americanized. Instead, it New Orleanized the Americans. This city became the pressure cooker of the Purchase, where the modern American identity, a mixture of many races, languages, and dreams, was first truly tested. While the politicians saw the Louisiana Purchase as a map of power, and the merchants saw it as a map of gold, President Jefferson saw it as a map of prehistory. Jefferson was a man obsessed with natural history. He didn't just want the land, he wanted the secrets of the earth that he believed were hidden in the shadows of the Missouri River. This chapter pulls back the curtain on the strange, scientific fever dream that drove the American exploration of the West, a journey that felt more like science fiction than history. The mammoth obsession. At the time of the Purchase, the scientific world was locked in a heated debate. A famous French scientist, the Count de Buffon, had insulted the New World, claiming that American animals were small, weak, and degenerate compared to European ones. Jefferson took this as a personal insult to the American spirit. He became obsessed with finding the megalon, a giant ground sloth, and the American mastodon. He refused to believe that any species could go extinct. He famously told Meriwether Lewis that as they traveled west, they might encounter living, breathing, woolly mammoths roaming the plains. In the West, Jefferson whispered to his colleagues, nature is still in its primal state. The giants of the past must still be there. When Lewis and Clark set off, they weren't just looking for a river, they were looking for monsters. They carried detailed instructions to look for bones, tusks, and any signs of massive, pre-deluge creatures. This wasn't just science, it was a quest to prove that America was the home of the strongest, largest life forms on Earth. The mountain of salt and the volcanoes. The rumors coming out of the Purchase were wild and hallucinogenic. Early fur trappers, eager to impress the president, brought back stories that sounded like fairy tales. One of the most famous was the Great Mountain of Salt. It was rumored that somewhere in the heart of the territory, modern-day Oklahoma or Kansas, there was a mountain 180 miles long and 45 miles wide, composed of solid, shimmering white salt. In an era before refrigeration, salt was white gold, essential for preserving meat. Jefferson actually included this salt mountain in his official report to Congress. The Federalists laughed him to scorn. They wrote satirical poems about Jefferson's salty mountain and his mammoth dreams, calling him a delusional philosopher who had wasted $15 million on a collection of tall tales. But for the explorers, these myths were the maps they followed into the heart of darkness. The Spirit Mound and the Little People. As Lewis and Clark pushed deeper into what is now South Dakota, they encountered legends from the Sioux and Omaha tribes that chilled their blood. They were told of the Maha Creek and a place called the Spirit Mound.
the local tribes refused to go near the hill, claiming it was inhabited by little people, devils only 18 inches tall, with oversized heads, who killed anyone who approached with tiny razor-sharp arrows. On a sweltering August day in 1804, Lewis and Clark, driven by Enlightenment curiosity, decided to investigate. They hiked to the top of the mound, bracing for a confrontation with the supernatural. They found nothing but a stunning view of the prairies and a massive swarm of insects. This moment symbolized the clash of worlds, the ancient spiritual mysteries of the land meeting the cold, measuring eyes of the American scientists. The Americans were disenchanting the West 1 mile at a time. The biological bounty. Even though they didn't find living mammoths, what they did find was a biological explosion that felt like another planet. They encountered animals that no white man had ever cataloged. The grizzly bear, a creature so massive and terrifying that it took 10 bullets to bring one down. Lewis wrote in his journal that he would rather fight 24 armed men than one great white bear. The prairie dog, which they called barking squirrels. They were so fascinated by them that they actually captured one and sent it alive in a crate across the ocean to Jefferson. The pronghorn antelope, an animal so fast it seemed to defy gravity. Every new animal was a trophy of the purchase. Jefferson transformed the East Room of the White House into a museum.
Cinematic exploration of the War of 1812 in the West. This is the trial by fire chapter, where the Louisiana Purchase was almost lost, the White House was burned, and a ragtag army of outlaws and frontiersmen stood against the greatest empire on earth to save the American dream. Chapter 18, The Final Exam, Fire on the Mississippi. By 1812, the new car smell of the Louisiana Purchase had worn off, replaced by the bitter scent of gunpowder and salt air. The United States had bought the land, but they hadn't truly secured it. Across the Atlantic, the British Empire, having finally dealt with Napoleon's main threat, turned its cold, vengeful eyes back toward its rebellious cousins. To the British, the Louisiana Purchase was a fraudulent deal made with a dead man walking, Napoleon. They decided it was time to take it back. This wasn't just a war for sailors' rights, it was a war to recolonize the heart of America. 1. The strategy of strangulation. The British plan was simple and terrifying. They would launch a 3-pronged attack to strangle the United States. While one force burned Washington, D.C., and another attacked through Canada, the third and most powerful force would sail into the Gulf of Mexico. Their target? New Orleans. The British knew that if they captured New Orleans, they would own the plug to the Mississippi River. They could lock the Louisiana Territory from the bottom, effectively trapping every American farmer in the West. They didn't just want to win a battle, they wanted to cancel the 1803 treaty and turn the American West into a British province. 2. The burning of the dream. In 1814, the news hit the West like a thunderclap. Washington, D.C. had fallen. The British had torched the White House in the Capitol. President James Madison, one of the architects of the purchase, was in hiding. To the people living in the Louisiana Territory, it felt like the end of the world. The Empire of Liberty was being turned to ash. The British Navy, fresh from defeating Napoleon, arrived in the Gulf with 50 ships and 10,000 veteran soldiers, the Invincibles, who had crushed the French. Against them stood a single controversial man, Andrew Jackson. Jackson's Ghost Army. Andrew Jackson, a lean, iron-willed general from Tennessee, arrived in New Orleans to find a city in a state of total panic. The Creoles didn't trust him, the French didn't like him, and the Spanish were rooting for the British. Jackson did something that changed the American identity forever. He realized he couldn't win with just regular soldiers. He built a coalition of the damned. His army was a living map of the Louisiana Purchase itself. The Kentucky and Tennessee long rifles, rugged frontiersmen who had moved west after 1803. The free men of color, the elite battalion of black soldiers from New Orleans who were fighting for their right to be citizens. Jean Lafitte's pirates, the outlaws of Barataria Bay, who provided the gunpowder and cannons that Jackson desperately needed. Choctaw warriors, who saw the British as a greater threat than the Americans. For the first time in history, the purchase was fighting for itself. This wasn't a war of kings, it was a war of the people who actually lived on the soil. 4. The Battle in the Mist. On January 8, 1815, the British marched across the Chalmette plantation toward Jackson's line. They moved in perfect red-coated formation, their bayonets gleaming through the thick river fog. They expected the Americans to run. They were wrong. Behind a massive mud wall, Jackson's ghost army waited. When the fog lifted, the American cannons, manned by Lafitte's pirates, and the long rifles of the Kentuckians unleashed a wall of lead. In less than 30 minutes, the invincible British army was decimated. Over 2,000 British soldiers fell. The Americans lost only a handful. It was the most lopsided victory in military history. And the ironic part? The war was already over. A peace treaty had been signed in Europe weeks earlier, but the news hadn't reached New Orleans. 5. The receipt of ownership. Even though the Treaty of Ghent had already been signed, the Battle of New Orleans was the final receipt for the Louisiana Purchase. If the British had won, they likely would have ignored the peace treaty and kept the city, citing Napoleon's illegal sale. Jackson's victory forced the world to acknowledge that the United States was a permanent power. It validated Jefferson's gamble. It proved that the Mississippi was American, the West was American, and the Louisiana Purchase was no longer a deal, it was a destiny. 6. The birth of the Wild West legend. As the smoke cleared from the battlefield, a new era began. The soldiers went home, but they didn't go back to the East Coast. They stayed. They took their land bounties and pushed further into the Purchase, into Missouri, into Arkansas, and towards the plains. The Old World had been defeated for the last time on American soil. The eyes of the nation turned away from the Atlantic and towards the sunset. The Louisiana Purchase was finally, truly, and violently bought and paid for. By the 40s and 50s, the Louisiana Purchase was no longer a new territory. It was the center of the American universe. But the $15 million paid to Napoleon bought something no one expected: a geopolitical time bomb. Every square mile of that rich black soil became a battlefield for the soul of the nation. The question was no longer, what did we buy, but rather, what kind of country will we be? 1. The cotton engine and the human cost. The southern half of the Purchase, Louisiana, Arkansas, and Missouri, had become the most profitable land on earth. The invention of the cotton gin turned the Mississippi Valley into a white gold factory, but this wealth was fueled by a brutal expansion of slavery. The domestic slave trade became a massive, forced migration. Enslaved people were sold down the river from the old tobacco states of Virginia and Maryland to the new harsh labor camps of the Louisiana Territory. The Purchase had accidentally created a massive, lucrative, and cruel empire of bondage that the Founding Fathers never envisioned. 2. The Missouri Compromise, the first crack. The trouble began in earnest in 2020, when Missouri, the heart of the Purchase, asked to join the Union as a slave state. It nearly broke the country. For the first time, the North and South looked at each other not as brothers, but as enemies. To keep the peace, Congress drew a literal line across the Louisiana Purchase, the 36-degree 33rd parallel. Everything north of the line, except for Missouri, was free. Everything south could be slave. Thomas Jefferson, hearing this from his retirement at Monticello, was terrified. He wrote, "This momentous question, like a fire bell in the night, awakened and filled me with terror. I considered it at once as the knell of the Union."
The man who bought the land realized that the line in the sand was actually a crack in the foundation. 3. Bleeding Kansas. The purchase exploded. By the 50s and 60s, the compromise was shattered. The focus shifted to the Kansas Territory, another piece of the 1803 deal. The government decided on popular sovereignty, meaning the people.
They didn't just buy dirt and trees, they bought New Orleans. At the time, New Orleans was unlike any other city. When the United States purchased Louisiana, they didn't just buy dirt and trees, they bought New Orleans. At the time, New Orleans was unlike any other city in America. It wasn't like the brick-and-mortar Protestant towns of Boston or Philadelphia. It was a Mediterranean fever dream dropped into a Louisiana swamp, a place of wrought iron balconies, hidden courtyards, and a social structure so complex it made the head of any rational American spin. The Creole Resistance. The people of New Orleans, the Creoles, descendants of French and Spanish settlers, did not want to be American. To them, the Americans were kindtucks, loud, unwashed, violent frontiersmen who chewed tobacco and had no respect for the fine arts of wine, fencing, or the Catholic Church. When the first American governor, William C.C. Claiborne, arrived, he didn't speak a word of French or Spanish. He sat in the cabildo, the town hall, and tried to explain trial by jury to a population that followed the Napoleonic Code. In the American system, you were innocent until proven guilty. In the French system, the law was the word of the state. The Creoles saw the American legal system as chaotic and barbaric. For the first few years, the city was a powder keg. There were brawls in the streets over which language should be spoken in the markets, and riots in the ballrooms over whether a French waltz or an American square dance should be played first. The third class, the free people of color. The most unique, and for the Americans the most terrifying part of New Orleans was the existence of a massive, wealthy, and educated class of free people of color, gens de couleur libre. Unlike the rest of the American South, where you were either white and free or black and enslaved, New Orleans had a middle ground. These were people of mixed African and European descent who owned property, ran businesses, and even served in their own elite military militias. They spoke perfect French, dressed in the latest Parisian fashions, and held high social status. When the Americans arrived with their rigid two-tiered racial laws, they tried to strip these people of their rights. The free people of color fought back with petitions, lawsuits, and the threat of armed resistance. They were the living contradiction to the American dream, proving that the racial lines the U.S. was trying to draw were far more blurred than the politicians in Washington wanted to admit. Voodoo and the shadow economy. While the politicians argued in the daylight, a different power ruled the night, Marie Laveau and the world of New Orleans voodoo. The purchase had brought a wave of refugees from the Haitian Revolution, both planters and enslaved people. They brought with them a powerful, secretive religion that blended West African spirits with Catholic saints. In the dark corners of Congo Square, the drums beat every Sunday. This was a shadow government. Enslaved people used these gatherings to exchange information, plan escapes, and maintain a culture that the American owners could not understand or control. For the American newcomers, the sound of the drums was a constant reminder that they had bought a territory they did not truly possess. The Pirate King, Jean Lafitte. You cannot tell the story of the Louisiana Purchase without the man who owned the coast. Jean Lafitte was a privateer, a polite word for pirate, who ran a massive smuggling empire out of Barataria Bay. He didn't care about the U.S. Treasury or Napoleon's treaties. He saw the purchase as a massive business opportunity. He smuggled stolen goods and enslaved people directly into the city, bypassing U.S. taxes. For decades after 1803, The Louisiana Purchase was a place of great silences. If you stood in the middle of the Nebraska prairie, the nearest civilization was weeks of hard travel away. The land was so vast that it threatened to swallow the United States whole. Many feared the country would eventually break into 3 or 4 smaller nations because communication was simply too slow. Then came the Iron Horse, the transcontinental ambition. In the 1860s, even as the Civil War was raging, Abraham Lincoln signed the Pacific Railway Act. The goal was insane: to stitch the Louisiana Purchase together with ribbons of steel. The railroad wasn't just a way to move people, it was the nervous system of the Purchase. Before the Golden Spike, it took 6 months to cross the territory by wagon. After the Golden Spike was driven, it took 6 days. The great American desert was suddenly open for business. The silence of the plains was replaced by the rhythmic thundering of steam engines. The Great Buffalo Slaughter. This technological triumph had a horrific shadow. The railroads divided the great buffalo herds that had roamed the Purchase for millennia. The U.S. government realized that if they killed the buffalo, they would kill the independence of the Native American tribes that relied on them. In the span of just 20 years, the buffalo population went from 30 million to less than 1,000. It was one of the fastest and most intentional ecological disasters in history. The wild was being systematically removed from the West to make room for the grid. The sod busters and the dust. With the railroad came the homesteaders. The government offered 160 acres of purchase land for free to anyone who could farm it for 5 years. Millions of people from Norway, Russia, Germany, and Ireland poured into the heart of the continent. Because there were no trees on the plains, they built their houses out of the earth itself, sod houses. They were literally living inside the Louisiana Purchase. These sod busters flipped the soil of the prairies for the first time in history. They turned the ancient grasslands into the world's breadbasket. But by breaking the ancient root systems of the grass, they unknowingly set the stage for the Dust Bowl of the 1930s. The land was giving up its riches, but it was also being pushed to its limits. The rise of the cow towns. The Purchase created a new American archetype, the cowboy. With the buffalo gone, the vast grasslands of the Purchase became the world's largest cattle ranch. Legend says the Wild West happened everywhere, but the real Wild West happened in the Purchase, in places like Dodge City, Kansas, and Abilene. This was where the Texas Longhorns were driven north to meet the railroads. It was a world of saloons, gunfights, and dusty trails, a brief, violent, and romantic era that would define American movies and mythology for the next century. The $15 million deal had created the world's most enduring folk hero. The final map, 1912. It took over 100 years, but by 1912, the last piece of the Louisiana Purchase was officially organized into a state. The frontier was declared closed. What Jefferson had bought as a mysterious, mammoth-filled wilderness was now a high-speed network of cities, farms, and factories. The 1803 treaty was no longer a deal. It was the solid ground of a global superpower. The ultimate epilogue, the 3-cent miracle. As we close this 10,000-word journey, we return to a quiet room in Paris in 1803. Robert Livingston, standing next to James Monroe, looked at the document they had just signed. He turned to the French ministers and said, "We have lived long, but this is the noblest work of our whole lives. The instruments we have just signed will cause no tears to be shed. They prepare ages of happiness for innumerable generations of the human race." Livingston was mostly right.
The purchase created ages of happiness for millions who found freedom and wealth on its soil, but it also caused oceans of tears for those who were displaced and enslaved to build that wealth. The Louisiana Purchase is the ultimate American story. It is a story of while the pioneers were fighting the elements and the politicians were fighting each other, a third war was being waged. This was the War of the Cartographers and Spies. In 1803, a map wasn't just a piece of paper, it was a weapon. Because the boundaries of the Louisiana Purchase were never clearly defined in the treaty, the next 50 years became a high-stakes game of invisible borders, where a single misplaced river on a map could trigger a war between empires. The Spanish Paranoia. The Spanish Empire, watching from their strongholds in Mexico and Santa Fe, was absolutely terrified. They realized that by selling Louisiana to the Americans, Napoleon had effectively put a loaded gun to the head of the Spanish silver mines. The Spanish king, Carlos IV, ordered a secret policy of containment. Spanish spies were embedded in every major American port. They were tasked with one mission: to sabotage American westward expansion. They spread rumors of cannibal tribes and unpassable deserts to